The last time I saw my son's face clearly, I was standing in front of a closed casket. There was no body inside. The county in Colorado had told me that much, gently, carefully. The way people speak to someone they know is about to break. The car had gone off Route 550 sometime in the early hours of a November morning, rolled 300 feet down into a ravine, and burned. They found the chassis. They found the license plate, bent almost in half, but readable. They found a belt buckle I had given him for his 22nd birthday, engraved with the initials D.R.H., Daniel Ray Holt. They found enough to know he had been there, and not enough to bring home. So we held a service with an empty casket. My wife picked out a dark blue suit to put inside it, because she said she needed something to look at, something to say goodbye to, and I understood that. I stood beside her and held her hand while the pastor spoke, and I looked at that casket, and I tried to feel something final. I tried to feel the door closing. I told myself it had closed. For 9 years, I told myself that. My son had been 23 years old when he left for that road trip. He had just finished his degree in civil engineering, had a job lined up in Phoenix starting in January, and he wanted one last stretch of open road before real life started. That was how he put it when he called me the night before he left real life, like the 23 years before had been some kind of rehearsal. I told him to drive safe. He said he always did. I said that wasn't what I asked. He laughed, and I laughed, and that was the last phone call. 3 days later, a state trooper from R.A. County knocked on our door. I won't go into what the next weeks looked like. If you have lost someone suddenly, without warning, without a body to bury or a wound to point to, you already know what that kind of grief does to the inside of a house. It gets into the walls. It changes the way light falls through the windows. My wife and I moved around each other for months like two people in a house that had become unfamiliar, the furniture in all the wrong places. She died 4 years after my son did. Her heart gave out, that is what the doctors said, and I believed them, though part of me has always thought the word they were looking for was something else. She had simply used up what was left of it. I retired from my job as a structural engineer and moved from Nashville to a smaller house in Cookeville, Tennessee. 63 years old, alone, with a vegetable garden I didn't always tend, and a dog named Biscuit, who had belonged to my wife, and who still slept on her side of the bed. That was my life. It was quiet. Some days it was even peaceful, which I had learned was not the same thing as happy, but was something you could live inside without it killing you. I want you to understand that I had made my peace, or at least I had made something that looked enough like peace from the outside that I had stopped questioning it. Then the envelope arrived. It was a Tuesday in early October, the kind of Tennessee morning where the air smells like wood smoke and the leaves on the hickory trees have gone the color of old copper. I walked to the mailbox in my slippers, the way I always did, with Biscuit trotting ahead of me and looking important. There were 2 bills, a seed catalog I hadn't ordered, and a padded envelope with no return address. The postmark said Albuquerque, New Mexico. I didn't know anyone in Albuquerque. I stood at the end of my driveway for a long moment, just looking at it. My name was written on the front in handwriting I didn't recognize, careful, deliberate, like someone who was concentrating hard on forming each letter correctly. Not sloppy, not rushed, careful. Frank Holt, and then my address, and that was all. I took it inside and sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. Inside was a wallet, brown leather, water-stained, cracked along the fold, and a piece of notebook paper, folded twice. I picked up the wallet first. It took me several seconds to understand what I was looking at. The leather was so damaged that it took a moment to recognize the shape of it, the weight of it. But when I opened it and saw the Tennessee driver's license behind the clouded plastic window, I felt something happen to my chest that I do not have a word for. The photograph on the license was my son's face. 22 years old, slightly squinting against the DMV lights, the corner of a reluctant smile pulling at his mouth because he could never fully suppress it. His name, his date of birth, my address, the old Nashville address, listed as his home. Behind the license was a photograph, wallet-sized, the kind you get developed at a drugstore, soft at the edges from years of being carried. My son and me, on the back porch of the Nashville house, squinting into the summer sun. He had his arm around my shoulders. I remembered that afternoon. His mother had taken the picture. On the back of the photograph, in her handwriting, Danny and Dad, summer 2015. My hands were shaking when I unfolded the notebook paper. Sir, my name is Ray. I found this wallet in the lining of a jacket I bought at a thrift store here in Albuquerque about 3 weeks ago. I have been carrying it around since then, trying to decide what to do with it. I should tell you something, and I want to be upfront about it because I think you deserve that. I have no memory of my life before approximately 9 years ago. I woke up in a hospital in Gallup, New Mexico in November of 2015 with a severe head injury and no identification. The doctors told me I had likely been in some kind of accident. Nobody ever came to claim me. I have been living in New Mexico ever since, working when I can, staying in a shelter when I can't. I don't know what this wallet means. Maybe it belonged to someone who donated the jacket, and I am sending this to you for nothing. Maybe it will upset you, and I am sorry if it does. But I looked up your address, and it was still good, and I thought, if this were my family, I would want to know. If you want to contact me, the address at the bottom of this letter is the shelter where I am currently staying. I check my mail there. I'm sorry if this is painful. I just thought you should know. Ray. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time. The rational part of my mind, the engineering part, the part that had spent 40 years measuring load tolerances and stress calculations, started running numbers immediately. My son had disappeared in Colorado in November of 2015. Gallup, New Mexico is roughly 4 hours south of the Colorado border. A man woke up in a hospital in Gallup in November of 2015, with no memory and no identification. The timeline lined up. It lined up exactly. But I had also spent 9 years making sure I did not do this to myself. I had spent 9 years very carefully not looking for reasons to believe he might still be alive, because I had understood early on that road leads nowhere good. You cannot live in a permanent state of maybe. You cannot function. You have to close the door. I looked at the license again. I looked at the photograph. I called the shelter. The woman who answered was named Patricia, and she was kind and practical in the way that people who work with the displaced and the lost tend to be, not unkind, but efficient with their sympathy because they cannot afford to spend it all in one place. I told her I had received a letter from a man named Ray staying at their facility. She said yes. Ray had been with them on and off for a couple of years. I asked her if she could tell me anything about him. She was careful about what she shared, but she said he was a quiet man, worked odd jobs doing construction labor when his health allowed it, had some cognitive issues stemming from an old head injury. She said he was a good man. She said it the way you say something you mean. I asked if I could speak with him. There was a pause. Then she said she would ask him. I waited 4 minutes. I counted them. When the line clicked, the voice that came through was low and careful, the same quality as the handwriting, deliberate, like someone who had learned to be very precise about the few things they could control. Hello, he said. I didn't know what to say. I had planned what to say, and then the voice came through the phone and it disappeared. I managed, "This is Frank Holt. I got your letter." Another pause. "I wasn't sure you would call." "I almost didn't," I said. "That was true. Can I ask you something?" "Yes, sir." "The jacket you found the wallet in, do you remember anything about it? What it looked like?" He thought for a moment. Dark green, fleece lining. There was a tear in the right pocket that had been sewn up with black thread. The stitching wasn't very good. I closed my eyes. My son had a green jacket like that. He had torn the pocket on a fence post when he was 19, and I had watched him sew it up himself with a needle and thread from my wife's sewing kit, because he was too stubborn to ask her to do it properly. The stitching had been terrible. We had teased him about it for years. "Okay," I said. My voice was not steady. "Okay, Mr. Holt," he said. "I need you to know something. I'm not trying to be something I'm not. I genuinely do not remember. I'm not coming to you with a story. I found the wallet, and I thought someone should know." "I understand," I said. "Are you all right?" It was such a simple question. I almost laughed. "No," I said, "but that's okay. Can I come see you?" I drove to Albuquerque. 19 hours. I could have flown, but I needed the time. I needed the miles between Tennessee and New Mexico to exist as physical space I had to cross, because I was afraid of what would happen if I arrived too fast, before I had thought through every possibility, every way this could go wrong, every way I might be about to make a fool of myself, or, worse, let myself believe in something that wasn't there. I rehearsed what I would do when I saw him. I told myself, I will look at a stranger's face, and I will know immediately that this is not my son, and I will shake his hand and thank him for his kindness and drive home. That was the most likely outcome. That was the rational, measured, engineered outcome. I had done the grief work. I had closed the door. I was not the kind of man who fell apart over coincidences. I arrived at the shelter on a Thursday morning. Patricia met me at the front desk, a stout woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the manner of someone who had seen most things and was not easily rattled. She shook my hand firmly. She told me Ray was in the common room. She walked me down a hallway that smelled like industrial coffee and clean laundry, and she stopped at a doorway and said quietly, I just want you to know, whatever happens today, Ray is a good person. He was worried about sending that letter. He didn't want to cause you pain. He didn't cause it, I said. It was already there. She nodded and stepped aside. I walked through the doorway. There were 6 or 7 men in the room, sitting at tables, watching television, reading. I looked across the room, and I found him immediately, without having to search. He was sitting alone at a table near the window, his hands folded in front of him, watching the door. He had been waiting for me. He was thin, thinner than my son had been. His hair had gray in it, though he looked to be in his early 30s, and there was a scar that ran from the left side of his jaw up toward his ear, pale and settled in the way of old scars. He looked like a man who had been through something and had learned to carry it quietly. And his eyes. I want to be precise about this because I think it matters. I was looking for resemblance the way you look for it in photographs, in the shape of the face, the line of the nose, the set of the jaw. I was prepared to be scientific about it, but when he looked up and our eyes met, what I felt was not the result of any measurement. It was something older than that, something I had not felt since a delivery room 32 years ago when a nurse had placed a small, furious, red-faced boy in my arms, and I had looked down at him and known, past all language, that this was mine. My son had brown eyes with a ring of amber near the pupil that was almost invisible unless you were close. An unusual thing. His mother had pointed it out when he was a baby. This man had the same eyes. I sat down across from him because I didn't trust my legs to hold me much longer. We looked at each other for a moment that felt very long. You're Frank, he said. Yes. My voice came out rough. You're Ray. That's what they call me here. He paused. I don't actually know if that's my name. The doctors in Gallup, they asked me if anything felt right, and Ray was the only thing I could come up with. I don't know where it came from. Your middle name is Ray, I said. Daniel Ray Holt. Something moved across his face. Not recognition, exactly. Something quieter, like a word you almost remember. There for a moment, and then gone. Tell me about the accident, I said. What do you know? He told me what he knew, which wasn't much, only what had been reconstructed for him by doctors and social workers over the years. He had been found by a highway patrol officer on State Road 602 outside of Gallup on a November morning. He was on the shoulder of the road, unconscious, with severe head trauma, hypothermia, and a dislocated shoulder. No identification. No vehicle in the vicinity, though there had been reports of a car fire in a remote area of the San Juan Mountains 2 days earlier, several hundred miles north. Nobody had connected the two events at the time. He had spent 6 weeks in the hospital. He had emerged with no episodic memory of his life before, though his procedural memory, how to speak, how to read, how to use tools, how to work, remained largely intact. He knew things without knowing how he knew them. He could look at a structural blueprint and understand it immediately. He had spent 2 years doing construction work in Gallup before moving to Albuquerque. I need to tell you something else, he said. He pulled up the sleeve of his left forearm and set it on the table. There was a tattoo on the inside of his forearm, old, slightly blurred from time, A small rendering of a hammer and a set of calipers, the tools of an engineer with a banner beneath them. The ink in the banner was faded enough that it was hard to read, but it was still legible. It said "Built to Last." I put my hand over my mouth. I had taken my son to get that tattoo, his 21st birthday. He had designed it himself. He had shown it to me 2 weeks later. Nervous in the way that only a grown man showing his father something he cares about can be nervous. I had told him I liked it. I had told him I thought it suited him. He had been so relieved. "Mr. Holt," the man across from me said carefully, "are you all right?" I was not all right. I had not been all right in 9 years. And now I was sitting in a shelter in Albuquerque, New Mexico, looking at my dead son's tattoo on a living man's arm, and I was so far from all right that the word didn't apply to anything in my vicinity. "That tattoo," I said. My voice was barely working. "Do you know what it means to you?" He shook his head slowly. "No. I've always had it. I've always felt like it meant something, but I don't know what." "You got it on your 21st birthday," I said. "I was there. You were nervous to show it to me afterward because you thought I would be disapproving. You weren't expecting me to like it." He was very still. "How do I know you're telling me the truth? I mean, I'm not saying you're not. I'm just saying, how would I know?" "You don't," I said. "Not yet. But I do. And I'd like to find out." I got a room at a motel 2 miles from the shelter. I was not going to drive back to Tennessee without an answer, and I wasn't going to pressure this man into anything before we knew what we were dealing with. Patricia connected me with the caseworker who had handled his file for the last several years, a younger man named Marcus, who was thorough and quiet, and who made it clear, very gently, that he had seen people in desperate circumstances latch onto strangers before, and that he wanted to make sure nobody got hurt here. I respected him for that. I told him I understood completely. I told him I wanted a DNA test, and I would wait for the result, and I would not make any claims or any decisions until we knew. Marcus looked at me for a long moment and said, "You seem very sure." "I'm not sure of anything," I said, "but I know what I saw." The DNA test took 11 days. I know some people are going to ask about that, so let me explain it clearly. We used a private lab that Marcus had experience with, and they were able to turn around a paternity analysis in under 2 weeks. I had given a sample. The man who called himself Ray had given a sample. We had done this on day 2 of my stay, because he had agreed, and because I think part of him, whatever part of a man, survives below the level of memory needed to know as much as I did. During those 11 days, I stayed in Albuquerque. I ate breakfast most mornings at a diner 2 blocks from the shelter, and 3 times that week, Ray joined me. We talked the way 2 people talk when they are circling something enormous and cannot yet touch it directly. He told me about his years in New Mexico, the hospital, the halfway houses, the stretches of construction work, the slow building of a small life out of whatever materials were available. He was matter-of-fact about it, not self-pitying, and I recognized that quality because I had watched it develop in him from childhood. My boy had never been one for self-pity. I told him about his mother. I was careful about that. I didn't want to overwhelm him, and I didn't want to manipulate him with grief. But he asked me directly, on the second morning, "Was there a woman in the family?" And I said yes, there was, and she had passed 4 years after he disappeared. He was quiet for a long time after that. He looked out the window at the street. Then he said, "I'm sorry," and the way he said it made my throat close. On the 3rd morning, he brought something to show me. He had kept a small notebook over the years, he told me, where he wrote down anything that surfaced: images, feelings, words that seemed to carry weight without context. He slid it across the table. I turned the pages carefully. There was a drawing of a house, rendered in confident pencil strokes. It was not exact, but it was close enough. The proportions of our Nashville home, the shape of the front porch, the wide steps. He had drawn it years ago and had no idea what it was. There was a word written in large letters, circled and underlined, Tennessee. There was a description of a dream, a kitchen, yellow walls, a woman at the counter. I can't see her face. Something is baking. The whole room smells like it. My wife had painted our kitchen yellow the year after my son was born. She baked on Sunday mornings, always. The whole house smelled like it. I set the notebook down and pressed my fingers against my eyes and tried to collect myself. I know you don't know who I am yet, I said, when I could speak. I know the test hasn't come back. I'm not going to sit here and tell you what to feel or what to think. But I want you to know, whoever you are, whatever this turns out to be, the fact that you found that wallet and wrote that letter, instead of throwing it away, says a great deal about your character. And I'm grateful. He looked at me steadily. Can I ask you something? Of course. What was he like? Your son? And that was the question that undid me. Not the tattoo, not the eyes, not the yellow kitchen in the notebook. The simple, careful, heartbreaking question of a man asking about himself in the third person, because that was the only way he knew how to ask. I took a breath. He was stubborn, I said. Smart. Sometimes too smart for his own patience. He used to take things apart to see how they worked and then get frustrated when he couldn't put them back together perfectly. He had a laugh that was too loud for any indoor space he was ever in. He was kind, genuinely kind, not performatively, the kind that doesn't announce itself. He called his mother every Sunday morning. He called me when he needed advice, which I always took as a compliment, even when I couldn't help. I stopped. There was more. There was 23 years more, but that was enough for now. He sounds like someone worth looking for, the man across from me said quietly. He is. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Marcus reached me at the motel at 8:47. I had been awake since 5. I had not slept well in 11 days, which I considered entirely reasonable under the circumstances. Mr. Holt, he said. The lab sent the results. I sat down on the edge of the bed. Biscuit was back home with my neighbor, and I was suddenly very aware of how alone I was in that room, and how long I had been alone, and how much of the last 9 years I would give anything to undo. Tell me, I said. There was a brief pause, the kind that is not hesitation but preparation. The test confirms a biological paternity match. The probability is 99.998%. Another pause. Mr. Holt, he's your son. I cannot tell you exactly what happened in the next few minutes. I know I thanked Marcus. I know I sat on that bed for a while. I know that at some point I went into the bathroom and ran cold water over my wrists, the way my wife used to do when she was overwhelmed, because she had told me once that it helped, and I had never understood it until that morning. My son was alive. My son was alive, and he had been alive for 9 years, and he had been 40 minutes from the Colorado border when something went wrong and his car went off a road in the mountains. And he had been thrown clear somehow. That was the reconstruction. We eventually pieced together, and he had walked or crawled in the wrong direction, south instead of north, and had been found by the highway in New Mexico 2 days later, alive but empty of himself. 9 years. I called the shelter. Patricia answered, and I asked her to tell Ray, to tell my son, that I was on my way. He was sitting on a bench outside when I pulled into the parking lot. He stood up when he saw me, and even from a distance, I could see that Marcus had already spoken with him, because his face was different. Not overwhelmed, he was too controlled for that, but different. Open in some way it hadn't been before. I got out of the car and crossed the parking lot, and I stopped a few feet away from him because I did not know what the protocol was. I did not know how to do this. There is no script for this. Nobody has ever handed me a script for this. He solved it by extending his hand. I shook it. And then, because 9 years is 9 years, and because he was standing right there in front of me breathing, which was more than I had ever expected to have again, I didn't let go. I pulled him in and I held on, the way I had held on in a delivery room 32 years ago, with that same wordless certainty, and for a moment he went still the way a man does when he hasn't been held in a very long time and doesn't quite know what to do with it. Then his arms came up, and he held on too. We stood like that in the parking lot of a shelter in Albuquerque for what was probably an embarrassingly long time, and I didn't care at all. I want to be clear about what happened next, because I think it's important to tell the truth about it, rather than the version that sounds cleaner. My son did not get his memory back. That is not how this story ends. There was no dramatic flood of recollection, no moment where everything came rushing back and he knew who he was. The neurologists we consulted in the weeks that followed were careful and honest with us. The damage to the hippocampal structures was significant and old. Some things might surface over time, in fragments, the way they already had in that notebook. Some things might never come back. He knew his name now, Daniel Ray Holt. He practiced saying it carefully, the same way he had written that letter, deliberate, concentrating. He told me it didn't feel like a name yet, but he thought it might eventually. He knew that his mother had loved him, because I told him, and because he had asked me to. He knew about the yellow kitchen and the Sunday phone calls and the laugh that was too loud for indoors. He knew about the jacket with the badly stitched pocket, and the birthday tattoo and the road trip that had gone wrong on a November night in the mountains. He knew all of this, the way you know, a story someone has told you, not from the inside. Not yet, but with a kind of recognition, as though some part of him that lived below memory had been waiting to hear it confirmed. We drove back to Tennessee together. I had offered to fly him, but he wanted to drive. He said he had spent 9 years not knowing where he came from, and he wanted to see the miles go by. We took 2 days. We stopped at a diner in Amarillo, and he ordered the same thing I did without noticing, and I pointed it out. And he looked down at our plates, and something shifted in his face, not quite a smile, not quite a memory, but something that belonged to the same family as both. He slept for a long stretch of Texas and woke up somewhere in Oklahoma with the sun going sideways through the window and looked around for a moment, disoriented, and then looked at me and said, "We're going home, aren't we?" It was not a question. "We're going home," I said. "There are things I still don't know. There are questions I cannot answer, and I want to acknowledge them directly because I think you deserve that. I don't know exactly how the car went off the road. The working theory is black ice, which was present that night on Route 550, and a guardrail that had already been damaged in a previous incident and had never been repaired properly. The investigation found no evidence of another vehicle. It was an accident, a terrible, senseless accident, in the dark. I don't know why no one connected the man found in New Mexico to the car accident in Colorado. The honest answer is that 2 different counties in 2 different states, in the days before the databases talked to each other as well as they do now, simply didn't. A burned car with an identified license plate and a missing, presumed dead. A John Doe found 200 miles away, 2 days later. There was no reason, at the time, for anyone to put those 2 things together. I'm not angry about it. I came close to anger, once, and then I thought about what it had cost my son to spend 9 years not knowing who he was, and I decided anger was a luxury I couldn't afford. I don't know what the rest of this looks like. He is living in the house in Cookeville now, in his old room, the one I never changed, not out of hope, but out of inertia, because it had felt wrong to change it. He works with a neurologist in Nashville every 2 weeks. He has a therapist. He has learned to make coffee the way he apparently always made it, black with 1 spoonful of sugar, which he discovered by accident the first morning, and stared at the mug with an expression I would give a great deal to be able to describe accurately. Biscuit adopted him immediately and completely, which I take as an endorsement from a reliable source. Some evenings we sit on the back porch the way my wife and I used to sit, and I tell him things, small things, specific things, the kinds of details that make a life identifiable. The time he broke a window playing baseball at 14 and tried to replace the glass himself before I came home from work. The road trip we took to see a baseball game in Street. Louis, when he was 11, and he fell asleep in the car on the way back, and I carried him inside, and he was almost too big for it, but I managed. The way he used to drum his fingers on the table when he was thinking, a habit he apparently still has, because he does it now without knowing why. I don't tell him these things to give him his memory back. I have made my peace with the likelihood that most of it is gone. I tell him because these things happened, and they are his, and he deserves to know about them, even if he can only hold them the way you hold a story from the outside, with care. Last Sunday morning, I woke up to the smell of something baking. I came downstairs and he was in the kitchen, standing at the counter, frowning at a recipe he'd found in the back of a drawer. He had made a mess of the mixing bowl, and there was flour on his shirt, and he looked up when I came in with the expression of a man who has gotten into something more complicated than he expected and is too stubborn to ask for help. He had no idea where the recipe had come from or why he'd felt like trying it. He just had. It was my wife's recipe, her handwriting on the card. Cinnamon rolls, the ones she made on Sunday mornings for most of 20 years. The kitchen smelled like it always had. I sat down at the table and I looked at my son, standing in the kitchen of his family's home, alive, making his mother's recipe without knowing it was his mother's recipe. And I thought about the 9 years between then and now, and all the Sunday mornings I had sat in this kitchen alone, and all the versions of this moment I had never allowed myself to imagine because imagining them was too dangerous. He slid a plate in front of me and sat down across from me with his own. "Good?" he said. I tried one. They weren't as good as hers. He had used too much cinnamon and not quite enough butter, and the dough was slightly too thick. But they were close enough that it took me a moment to be able to answer him. "They're good," I said. He looked quietly pleased about that. He looked, for a moment, exactly like himself. I don't know what comes next. I don't know how much of my son I get back, and I don't know how much was lost in that ravine in the mountains 9 years ago and is gone for good. I don't know what it costs a man to rebuild an identity from the outside in, from other people's stories, from a notebook full of dreams, and a green jacket with a badly stitched pocket. What I know is this: he is here. He is sitting across the table from me. He is alive and breathing and eating something his mother would have made better, and he is mine. And when you have buried someone, when you have stood in front of a closed casket and said goodbye to an empty box, when you have spent 9 years learning to live inside the absence of someone when you get them back, in whatever form they come back to you, there is only one thing left to do. You open the door, you let them in, and you start from wherever you are. That is where we are. That is enough.